So tonight I'm going to talk to you about a recent episode of Law & Order SVU, which if you don't know is the longest running scripted television show in history. It's 21 years now. In this recent episode, there is a depiction of a 13-year-old girl, Evangeline, who is in Ohio and has been raped by her stepfather. And she goes to New York to acquire an abortion because of the heartbeat bills that have been passed in Ohio. And in the process of her getting this abortion, there's a missing persons report filed for her by her stepfather and her mother. And a legal fight begins where the Ohio Justice Department and the New York State Justice Department are disagreeing about whether or not this girl has a right to have an abortion. And the reason why I'm talking about this tonight is because Law & Order SVU is a show that has undoubtedly raised so much awareness about domestic abuse and changed the conversation on so many things. But I feel with this episode, they really dropped the ball, and I'm going to tell you why. The way that pro-life and pro-heartbeat bill advocates in the show, in the episode, are depicted is ridiculous. The only people advocating for the life of the baby is a rapist, an obviously abused woman, and two old white men, which is always the tagline, only old white men care about abortion. That's the only group of people that care. Those are the people that are advocating against this girl having an abortion. And yet all of the people advocating for her having the right to choose are diverse in ages, are backgrounds, in the position they have in the police department or in New York State. And in this episode, this young girl goes back and forth about whether or not to even have an abortion. One of the things that is never discussed is whether or not, being the fact that she is a serious Christian, and she talks about that, and that's a focal point of the episode, whether or not her emotional well-being will be impacted by this, whether or not she can deal with having guilt because of her beliefs because of this. That's never dived into. So even though there's this conversation about the health and the mental well-being of the mother, being that she's 13, the main facet of her at that age, which is her faith, is never talked about. And I think that's really important because one thing we never hear about abortion is how it impacts women afterwards. And this is a 13-year-old child. And yet the people in New York State are so willing to talk about it and to push it in this episode, but they're not talking about the long-term ramifications for this young girl, aside from saying her life will be ruined. And the other thing that makes no sense about this episode and why I feel it's skewed representation is that the main character of SVU, Detective Olivia Benson, who's the captain of SVU, is supposed to be the product of a rape. She's the child of a rape. And she talks about in earlier seasons, before we had so much political tension and focus on abortion, how she's grateful her mother didn't abort her. So basically what you're saying in this new episode is that Detective Benson's existence, her very ability to be in the world, not being erased, doesn't matter. It didn't matter because this girl can now be having an abortion. She can erase a person. So the main character, you're invalidating the presence and the life of the main character in this episode because the main character, however old she is, was all those years ago in the same position as this unborn baby. So for a show that is so capable of having difficult conversations, I feel like they failed here, and it's a very skewed representation. And just in closing, one of the reasons I'm talking about this is because nobody else did in the conservative world, and I feel like that's a problem because we always talk about the impact of culture, and yet this is a show that's a cultural landmark. It's been around since before I was born, and it has such a big impact on politics, on New York State, on young people. So many people watch it, and yet this was not covered in conservative media in anything, and I think that's a shame. And also, aside from that, there's an effort in the show to make it seem like, in this episode, that if you're advocating for this girl to have this baby, you're ruining her life. And that is something that's very big in this episode. And it shows that by having one of the characters, Detective Carisi, who's Catholic, who's I guess you could describe him as conservative. He has to sort of equate it in his mind that because it's a rape victim, because of that, she can have an abortion. So there's all this jumbling to confuse the fact that the main concept, the main principle hasn't changed, which is that this is still a human being. So I think it's important to talk about this, and it's also important to talk about the fact that we constantly hear about representation from the left, and yet pro-life advocates and young conservatives, young people who care about the pro-life issue, were so poorly represented in this episode. There were no young women talking about why abortion is bad. There was no representation in that way whatsoever. All we saw were a rapist defending the life of this baby, an abused woman, and two old white men, one of which is quite demonized by the detectives. So Conservatives have to talk about the lack of representation even in the storylines about heartbeat bills and in the storylines that talk about abortion, because in a show that's such a cultural landmark like this, to have such skewed representation is really wrong. I encourage all of you to go watch the recent episode. I think it's something, the title has the word choice in it, which is a real right on the nose thing. It's the most recent episode of Law & Order SVU, and think about whether or not you think representation of pro-life advocates or conservatives or Christians was skewed in that episode, because I do, and I was really disappointed by the episode. Thank you, everyone, and please like and share this, and remember, go check out